What if a single mistake could destroy a city? History is filled with disasters caused by human error, greed, and negligence. Explosions, nuclear meltdowns, and engineering failures have claimed thousands of lives, tragedies that could have been prevented. Some unfolded in seconds, others over decades, but all left a lasting impact. 1. Texas City Disaster. The Floating Bomb. On the morning of 16 April 1947, workers at the port of Texas City were loading cargo onto a French freighter named SS Grand Camp. The ship was carrying peanuts, twine, tobacco, and small arms, but its most dangerous cargo was 2,300 tons of ammonium nitrate, a highly explosive chemical used in fertilizers. At around 8 a.m., dock workers noticed smoke rising from the ship's cargo hold. They attempted to put out the fire with a bucket and a few fire extinguishers, but the flames were persistent. That's when the ship's captain made a fateful decision. He ordered the hatches to be sealed and had steam pumped into the cargo hold, hoping to smother the fire. But instead of extinguishing the flames, the heat inside the sealed compartment caused the ammonium nitrate to reach a critical temperature. Just after 9 a.m., the SS Grand Camp detonated with a force equivalent to a nuclear bomb. The explosion vaporized everything within 2,000 feet, sending a shockwave that shattered windows in Houston, nearly 50 miles away. The blast triggered a 15-foot tsunami, flooding coastal buildings and sweeping away workers. The fireball ignited nearby oil refineries, causing secondary explosions that spread the destruction even further. The devastation was staggering. Over 500 people lost their lives, including almost the entire Texas City Fire Department, which had responded to the initial fire. The bodies of some workers were never found, having been instantly incinerated by the blast. The disaster remains the deadliest industrial accident in United States history, a grim reminder of how dangerous unchecked chemicals can be. As Texas City struggled to recover, another disaster decades later would show the world how ammonium nitrate could wreak havoc once again, this time in the heart of Beirut. 2. Beirut Port. Explosion. A city obliterated for 6 years. 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate sat in a warehouse at the port of Beirut, stored improperly in the heat of the Middle Eastern sun. The chemical had been confiscated from a cargo ship in 2013, and despite repeated warnings from officials, no action was taken to remove or secure it. On the afternoon of 4 August 2020, a fire broke out in Warehouse 12. The flames spread quickly, igniting fireworks that had also been stored in the same location. As thick black smoke billowed over the port, bystanders recorded the scene on their phones, unaware of the catastrophe about to unfold. At 6:07 p.m., the ammonium nitrate ignited. The explosion was so massive that it registered as a 3.3 magnitude earthquake and was felt as far away as Cyprus, over 150 miles across the Mediterranean. A shockwave tore through Beirut, flattening buildings, shattering glass, and flipping cars like toys. The blast killed over 235 people, injured more than 7,000, and left 300,000 homeless in an instant. The destruction resembled the aftermath of a nuclear explosion, with entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. Hospitals were overwhelmed, struggling to treat thousands of wounded civilians. The government's failure to act on repeated warnings about the dangerous stockpile fueled public outrage, leading to mass protests and the resignation of Lebanon's prime minister. This disaster proved how a single act of negligence, allowing highly explosive chemicals to sit unattended for years, could devastate an entire city in seconds. And yet, Beirut was not the only place where stored chemicals led to mass destruction. Before Beirut, another explosion involving liquid gas turned a peaceful Mexican town into an inferno. 3. San Juanico LPG explosion, Mexico's inferno. On the morning of 19 November 1984, residents of San Juanico, a small town just north of Mexico City, were jolted awake by a thunderous explosion. The Pemex liquefied petroleum gas storage facility, which supplied nearly a third of Mexico City's gas, had ruptured. Within seconds, a massive cloud of highly flammable gas formed over the facility and surrounding areas. At 5:40 a.m., the gas cloud ignited. A series of massive fireballs erupted, sending flames hundreds of feet into the sky. The explosions were so powerful that they were mistaken for a nuclear blast. The shockwave leveled homes, burned vehicles, and killed hundreds instantly. Those living within 1,000 feet of the explosion site never stood a chance. Over 500 people perished, while thousands more suffered severe burns. Survivors described scenes of horror, melted buildings, people running while engulfed in flames, and an unbearable heat that made the air itself feel like fire. Many bodies were never identified as they had been completely incinerated. Investigations later revealed that the facility had been in poor condition for months. Safety equipment was either faulty or completely bypassed, and pressure gauges had been malfunctioning. The disaster could have been prevented, but years of neglect led to one of the worst industrial explosions in Latin American history. And yet, explosions aren't the only disasters caused by human negligence. Sometimes disaster strikes not in an instant but slowly, through a chain of miscommunications and errors that, if avoided, could have saved hundreds of lives. One such event occurred in Tenerife, where confusion on the runway led to the deadliest plane crash in history. 4. Tenerife Airport. Disaster. The deadliest plane crash. On 27 March 1977, the Los Rodeos Airport in Tenerife was unusually crowded. A terrorist bombing at the Gran Canaria Airport had forced several flights to divert to Tenerife, causing gridlock on the single available runway. Among the planes waiting for clearance were two Boeing 747 jumbo jets, one operated by KLM, the other by Pan American World Airways. As the hours passed, fog began to settle over the airport, reducing visibility to near zero. At 4:56 p.m., the KLM flight was given clearance to taxi down the runway, turn around, and prepare for takeoff. Meanwhile, the Pan Am flight was told to follow but take a different exit to avoid a collision. Then, in a tragic misunderstanding, the KLM pilot believed he had received clearance for takeoff. Without being able to see more than a few feet ahead, he accelerated down the runway, right toward the Pan Am flight, which was still taxiing in the thick fog. By the time the pilots saw each other, it was too late. At 160 miles per hour, the KLM aircraft tried to lift off, but its undercarriage tore through the top of the Pan Am plane. A massive explosion followed, engulfing both aircraft in flames. Of the 644 people on board both planes, only 61 survived, making it the deadliest aviation accident in history. Investigations determined that a combination of miscommunication, impatience, and poor weather conditions led to the disaster. KLM's pilot had mistakenly assumed he had takeoff clearance, and the air traffic control tower, overwhelmed by the congestion, failed to prevent the collision. This tragedy proved how in aviation even a small misunderstanding can lead to devastating consequences. But Tenerife was not the last time mismanagement led to an air disaster. Decades later, a mechanical failure in Japan would cause yet another horrifying loss of life. 5. Japan Airlines Flight 123. The fatal structural failure. On 12 August 1985, Japan Airlines Flight 123 took off from Tokyo's Haneda Airport bound for Osaka. The Boeing 747 was packed with passengers, mostly families returning home for the Obon holiday. Just 12 minutes into the flight, as the aircraft climbed past 24,000 feet, a sudden explosion-like sound shook the cabin. The aircraft's rear pressure bulkhead had ruptured, causing a violent decompression that tore off the vertical stabilizer and severed the hydraulic lines. The pilots fought desperately to regain control, but without hydraulics, the aircraft became nearly impossible to maneuver. The plane entered an uncontrollable oscillation, climbing and diving wildly as the crew struggled to steer using only engine power. For 32 minutes, passengers experienced sheer terror, knowing their fate was sealed. Flight 123 eventually slammed into the mountains of Gunma Prefecture at 500 miles per hour. The crash killed 520 of the 524 people on board, making it the deadliest single aircraft accident in history. Investigators later discovered that the rear pressure bulkhead had been improperly repaired years earlier. A small defect, invisible to the naked eye, had weakened the structure over time until it finally gave way, turning a routine flight into a tragedy. But aviation disasters were not the only ones to claim innocent lives. On the seas, another tragedy was unfolding. 6. MV Doña Paz, the floating inferno. On 20 December 1987, the Philippine passenger ferry MV Doña Paz set sail from Leyte, heading toward Manila. Officially, the ferry was carrying 1,500 passengers, but in reality, more than 4,000 people were crammed aboard. many without tickets. The ship's decks and corridors were overflowing with families hoping to reach their loved ones before Christmas. At 10:30 p.m., disaster struck. As the Doña Paz moved through the Tablas Strait, it collided with the MT Vector, a fully loaded oil tanker carrying over 1,000 tons of gasoline. The impact ruptured the Vector's cargo tanks, instantly igniting the fuel. Within seconds, a massive fireball engulfed both vessels. The water around them turned into a lake of fire. Passengers on the Doña Paz, many of whom were asleep, had no time to react. The few who managed to escape the flames were forced to jump into the burning sea, where most drowned or were severely burned. Of the estimated 4,300 passengers and crew, only 26 survived. The rest either perished in the flames or were lost at sea. Investigations revealed that the Doña Paz was operating without a working radio, delaying rescue efforts. The Vector, meanwhile, was not even licensed to be at sea. The tragedy remains the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in history. But it wasn't the only time a ship carried too many passengers. Just a few years later, another overloaded vessel would meet a similar fate. 7. MS Estonia, the ship that disappeared in minutes. On 28th of September 1994, the MS Estonia, a ferry carrying 989 passengers and crew, set sail from Tallinn, Estonia, bound for Stockholm, Sweden. The journey was supposed to take less than a day, but for most on board, it would end in tragedy. At just after 1 a.m., in the middle of the Baltic Sea, high waves battered the ship's bow visor, causing it to break off completely. With nothing to hold the sea back, thousands of gallons of water rushed into the car deck. The ship immediately began to list to one side. Passengers, many of whom were already asleep, were thrown from their bunks as the ferry tilted at an impossible angle. Panic spread through the corridors as people fought to climb toward the upper decks, but the steep incline made escape nearly impossible. Within minutes, Estonia rolled onto its side and vanished beneath the waves. Only 137 people survived, making it one of the deadliest maritime disasters in European history. The disaster raised serious concerns about ferry safety, as Estonia's bow visor had failed under conditions it should have withstood. But while this tragedy unfolded at sea, another disaster was brewing in an oil rig off the American coast. 8. Deepwater Horizon, the ocean on fire. On 20 April 2010, the Deepwater Horizon oil rig was drilling a well for BP in the Gulf of Mexico. The platform sat in over 5,000 feet of water, operating at the limits of modern engineering. That evening, a sudden surge of natural gas shot up the wellbore, overwhelming safety systems and reaching the surface, where it ignited in a massive explosion. The explosion instantly killed 11 workers and left the rig engulfed in flames. The remaining crew evacuated, but the inferno raged for nearly 2 days before the Deepwater Horizon sank, triggering an even greater catastrophe. With the well now uncontrolled, crude oil began pouring into the ocean at an alarming rate. For 87 days, the damaged wells spewed 210 million gallons of oil into the Gulf, creating the largest marine oil spill in history. The spill devastated marine ecosystems, killing thousands of dolphins, turtles, and birds. The cleanup effort stretched on for years, costing BP $65 billion in fines and settlements. Investigations later found that BP had cut corners on safety, ignoring signs that the well was unstable. The explosion and resulting spill were entirely preventable, a disaster fueled by corporate negligence. But while Deepwater Horizon was a modern catastrophe, another slow-moving disaster had been unfolding for decades, one that would wipe an entire sea off the map. 9. The Aral Sea Disaster, a vanishing ocean. For centuries, the Aral Sea, located between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, was one of the largest inland lakes in the world. Fed by the Amu Darya and Sir Darya rivers, it supported thriving fishing communities and provided water to millions. But in the 1950s, the Soviet Union launched an ambitious irrigation project, diverting these rivers to grow cotton in the desert. At first, the changes were subtle, but by the 1970s, the lake had lost more than half its volume. By the 1980s, fishing boats sat stranded in the middle of a desert, their hulls rusting under the sun. Without fresh water, the exposed seabed turned into a toxic wasteland. filled with pesticides and chemicals left behind from years of agricultural runoff. The consequences were devastating. Entire towns were abandoned as their water supply vanished. Strong winds carried toxic dust across the region, leading to widespread respiratory diseases. What was once a thriving ecosystem had become a barren wasteland. Efforts to restore the northern portion of the Aral Sea have had some success, but the southern half is considered beyond saving. The disaster stands as one of the greatest environmental failures of the 20th century. But it wouldn't be the last time human negligence led to an environmental catastrophe. Just a few years later, a nuclear accident in Ukraine would unleash invisible devastation on an unimaginable scale. 10. Chernobyl disaster, the silent killer. On 26 April 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in northern Ukraine became the site of the worst nuclear disaster in history. It was just after 1:23 a.m. when Reactor 4 suffered a catastrophic explosion, sending radioactive material into the atmosphere. The explosion was caused by a flawed safety test that went terribly wrong. Engineers had disabled critical safety systems to test the reactor's backup power, unaware that this would trigger an uncontrollable reaction. Within seconds, the reactor's core exploded, launching a fiery mass of radioactive debris into the night sky. The blast was so powerful that the reactor's heavy steel and concrete lid was blown off entirely. In the following days, a deadly cloud of radiation spread across Europe, forcing the evacuation of over 115,000 people. The Soviet government initially tried to cover up the disaster, delaying an international response. By the time the truth came out, thousands had already been exposed to lethal doses of radiation. Chernobyl remains an uninhabitable wasteland, a haunting reminder of what happens when safety measures are ignored. But as devastating as this disaster was, it would not be the last time a nuclear plant meltdown threatened the world. 11. Fukushima. Nuclear disaster, a tsunami's fallout. On 11 March 2011, Japan was struck by a 9.0 magnitude earthquake, triggering a tsunami that devastated coastal cities. One of the hardest-hit areas was the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, where towering waves overwhelmed the plant's defenses, flooding the reactor buildings and knocking out power. With no electricity, the plant's cooling systems failed, causing the reactors to overheat and explode. Radioactive material began leaking into the surrounding environment, forcing over 160,000 people to evacuate. Despite efforts to contain the damage, radiation continued to seep into the ocean for years, contaminating marine life. Unlike Chernobyl, the Fukushima disaster wasn't caused by human error alone, it was a failure to prepare for the inevitable. Experts had warned for years that the plant's seawalls were too low to withstand a major tsunami, yet no action was taken. When disaster struck, the consequences were immediate and irreversible. The Fukushima crisis proved that even the most advanced technology is powerless against poor planning. But while nuclear accidents capture global attention, other human-made disasters unfold quietly, hidden in the walls of unsafe buildings, until they collapse. 12. Rana Plaza. Collapse. The cost of cheap labor. On 24 April 2013, thousands of garment workers in Bangladesh started their morning shift at Rana Plaza, an 8-story commercial building in Dhaka. Many had seen cracks in the walls the day before, but management insisted the structure was safe. At 8:57 a.m., as sewing machines hummed and workers stitched clothing for international brands, the building suddenly began to shake. Within seconds, the entire structure collapsed like a house of cards, trapping thousands beneath the rubble. The disaster killed more than 1,100 people and injured over 2,500, making it the deadliest accident in the history of the garment industry. Investigations revealed that the building had been poorly constructed with unauthorized additional floors and substandard materials. The owners had ignored multiple warnings about structural instability, prioritizing profits over worker safety. The collapse exposed the harsh realities of fast fashion, where brands demand cheap labor at any cost. Despite global outrage and promises of reform, factory conditions in many parts of the world remain dangerous. But Rana Plaza wasn't the first time greed led to disaster. Almost 2 decades earlier, a department store collapse in South Korea claimed hundreds of lives. 13. Sampoong department store collapse. Greed over safety. In the heart of Seoul, South Korea, the Sampoong department store was a symbol of prosperity when it opened in 1989. The luxurious shopping center attracted thousands of visitors daily, but its foundation was built on corruption and negligence. During construction, engineers warned that the building's structure was unstable, but the owner refused to make adjustments, even adding an unauthorized fifth floor. Over time, cracks began appearing in the support columns. By June of 1995, the building was on the verge of collapse. On 29 June, at 5:52 p.m., the ceiling suddenly buckled and the upper floors gave way. In less than 20 seconds, the entire department store crumbled, burying over 1,500 people under concrete and steel. The disaster killed 502 people and injured more than 1,000. Investigations revealed that greedy cost-cutting decisions had made the building a death trap. The owner, who had ignored multiple safety warnings, was later convicted of manslaughter. The Sampoong collapse was a stark reminder of what happens when profit takes precedence over human lives. But even when buildings stand tall, human error in their construction can lead to catastrophe, something the engineers behind the Tacoma Narrows Bridge learned too late. 14. Tacoma Narrows Bridge collapse. A bridge that danced in the summer of 1940, the Tacoma Narrows Bridge in Washington was hailed as an engineering marvel. At the time, it was the third longest suspension bridge in the world, stretching nearly 6,000 feet across the Puget Sound. But from the day it opened, the bridge exhibited a strange and alarming behavior. It swayed and twisted violently in the wind. Nicknamed Galloping Gertie, the bridge's design flaws became evident within months. Engineers had built it with insufficient stiffness, making it highly vulnerable to wind forces. On 7 November 1940, strong winds of just 42 miles per hour caused the bridge to enter a terrifying twisting motion. At 11 a.m., the violent oscillations ripped the structure apart, sending massive chunks of concrete and steel crashing into the water below. In just 4 minutes, the entire bridge collapsed. Miraculously, there were no human casualties, but the footage of the disaster became one of the most studied engineering failures in history. The Tacoma Narrows collapse was a lesson in aerodynamics and structural design, proving that a bridge's flexibility can be just as dangerous as its strength. Engineers learned from this mistake, ensuring that future suspension bridges were built to withstand wind forces. But while this disaster resulted in no loss of life, another engineering failure in China would claim thousands. 15. Banqiao Dam. Failure, the deadliest dam collapse. In the summer of 1975, heavy monsoon rains pounded China's Henan province, filling the reservoirs behind the Banqiao Dam to critical levels. Originally built in the 1950s as part of an ambitious flood control project, the dam was designed to withstand major storms. But engineers had not accounted for the immense rainfall brought by Typhoon Nina, which dumped an entire year's worth of rain in just 3 days. By 7 August, the water levels had surpassed safety limits. The dam's spillways, meant to release excess water, were clogged with debris, and the pressure kept rising. Then, in the early hours of 8 August, the dam catastrophically failed, sending a massive wall of water crashing through the valley. The flood wiped out entire villages, drowning an estimated 171,000 people. Millions more were left homeless, struggling to survive in the aftermath of one of the worst engineering disasters in history. The Chinese government initially covered up the extent of the tragedy, and details only emerged decades later. The Banqiao Dam failure was a stark reminder that even the strongest structures can crumble under extreme conditions. But while this was one of the deadliest floods in history, another disaster involving water would take place decades later, this time caused by human negligence rather than natural forces. 16. Love Canal disaster. America's hidden poison. In the 1940s, the Love Canal neighborhood in Niagara Falls, New York, seemed like the perfect place to build homes and schools. What the residents didn't know was that beneath their feet lay a ticking time bomb, over 21,000 tons of toxic industrial waste, dumped by the Hooker Chemical Company. For years, the chemicals lay buried, out of sight and out of mind. But by the 1970s, strange occurrences began alarming residents. Children returned from playing outside with unexplained burns on their skin. Families reported mysterious illnesses, birth defects, and an unusual number of miscarriages. Then came the final warning. Black sludge began seeping into basements and playgrounds, releasing noxious fumes into the air. By 1978, the government declared the Love Canal a national emergency. Hundreds of families were evacuated, their homes abandoned to toxic decay. Investigators discovered that over 200 different chemicals, including carcinogens like benzene and dioxin, had contaminated the soil and water supply. The Love Canal disaster led to the creation of the Superfund Act, a law that forced companies to clean up hazardous waste sites. But despite the lessons learned, similar chemical disasters would continue to unfold, including one in India that became the world's worst industrial accident. 17. Bhopal gas tragedy. A toxic cloud. On the night of 2 December 1984, thousands of people in Bhopal, India went to sleep unaware that they would never wake up. At the Union Carbide pesticide plant, a storage tank containing 42 tons of methyl isocyanate gas had been leaking for hours. The highly toxic chemical used to produce insecticides had reacted with water inside the tank, causing a runaway chemical reaction. At just past midnight, a dense, invisible cloud of poison rolled through the city. Those who inhaled it felt an unbearable burning in their lungs, as if they were suffocating from the inside out. People collapsed in the streets, coughing up blood. Thousands died before they could even leave their homes. By morning, more than 3,000 people were dead. Over the following weeks and months, the death toll climbed to over 15,000, with 500,000 others suffering permanent health damage. Investigations later revealed major safety violations at the plant, including broken safety valves, poor maintenance, and a failure to warn the surrounding population. The Bhopal disaster remains the worst industrial accident in history. But while this tragedy was caused by human negligence, another disaster in Canada would result from a deadly combination of mechanical failure and mismanagement. 18. Lac-Mégantic rail disaster, a runaway train's explosion. On the night of 5 July 2013, a freight train carrying over 70 crude oil tankers was parked outside the small town of Lac-Mégantic, Canada. The engineer, following standard procedure, set the brakes and left for the night. But what no one realized was that the brakes had not been set properly. At just past 1 a.m., the train began rolling downhill, gathering speed as it hurtled toward the sleeping town. With no one on board to stop it, the unmanned train derailed at full speed, sending a fireball into the night sky as multiple tankers exploded. Within minutes, downtown Lac-Mégantic was engulfed in flames, burning at temperatures high enough to melt steel and vaporize buildings. 47 people lost their lives, many of them trapped inside buildings as the fire raged out of control. The disaster exposed serious flaws in railway safety, including the risks of leaving hazardous cargo unattended. The Lac-Mégantic explosion remains one of the worst rail disasters in modern history. But while this tragedy resulted from a failure to secure a train, another disaster involving a high-speed train in Germany would reveal the deadly consequences of engineering flaws. 19. Eschede train disaster, a high-speed catastrophe. On 3 June 1998, a German high-speed intercity express train traveling from Munich to Hamburg was cruising at 125 miles per hour when disaster struck near the town of Eschede. A single metal wheel rim had cracked, something engineers had overlooked in their inspections. As the train sped along the tracks, the damaged wheel finally gave way, causing the first carriage to derail. But the train didn't stop. At such high speeds, the derailed carriage tore into the support pillars of an overpass, causing the bridge to collapse directly onto the moving train. The force of the impact crushed multiple carriages, killing 101 passengers and crew members. Survivors described the chaos inside the train as seats were ripped from the floor, windows shattered, and metal beams collapsed onto passengers. Investigators later found that the train's wheel design had been flawed from the start, with cracks forming due to normal wear and tear. The tragedy led to major changes in railway safety standards, ensuring that similar disasters would never happen again. But while the Eschede disaster was caused by a single failing component, another disaster in Lebanon was the result of decades of poor governance and neglect. 20. Beirut garbage crisis, a city drowning in waste. In the summer of 2015, garbage started piling up in the streets of Beirut, Lebanon, with landfills overflowing and no proper waste management plan in place. Mountains of trash began rotting in residential areas, releasing toxic fumes and contaminating the air. As the crisis worsened, rats and disease spread, creating severe public health risks. Residents protested, demanding that the government take action. But officials were slow to respond, and by the time emergency measures were introduced, much of the damage was done. The garbage crisis became a symbol of Lebanon's failing infrastructure and corruption, highlighting how mismanagement could lead to a slow-moving but devastating humanitarian disaster. Even years later, Lebanon struggled to manage its waste, with much of it being dumped into the sea or burned illegally. The crisis served as a warning of what happens when governments ignore basic public services. From explosions to environmental destruction, transportation failures to industrial accidents, these disasters all share one common factor: they were entirely preventable. Human error, corporate greed, and government negligence turned ordinary situations into mass tragedies, and unless history is learned from, it is doomed to repeat itself. With that, we have reached the end of today's video. If you have come this far with us, be sure to check out other videos on the channel.